The past is everywhere, in books, in museums, in universities, and more. And bringing that history to life is a historian. But what exactly do they do that makes them such a vital part of society? And how exactly do they create a better understanding of the past? Nigel Raab tackles such questions in his new book, Who is the Historian? He is an associate professor of history at Loyola Marymount University, and he joins us now for more. Welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much.
I really liked the book. So you actually dedicate this book not to your mom or your dad or to your wife or your children, but you dedicate it to curiosity. I thought that was really interesting. Why?
Well, I really just wanted to express the idea that when you're studying history, what you're doing is you're opening up avenues for exploration and you're opening up possibilities. You're not sort of just narrowing things down to one answer. You really just gotta open up your mind and search.
And the book is called Who is the Historian? In a previous life,
Yes.
you used to be an engineer.
This is correct.
So how did you make the shift? Or why did you make the shift?
Well, I studied engineering, and interestingly enough, I just had my 25th reunion I studied at Queen's in Kingston, and met all my engineering friends, which I was brought right back to my previous self, my first self. But when I was studying engineering, I was like, the math, the physics, it was interesting, it was challenging, but for me, it wasn't enough. I wanted something which was more related to human experience, more complicated in terms of how do people react in different circumstances? How has humanity changed over time? Those social, cultural, political questions were what really grabbed me inside. And so I can only spend so much time on a formula when I really wanted to do more historical research. So I made the switch and I have not looked back. I'm very happy.
Now, when we say historian, what images jump into mind? Like what we have, like the stereotypes we have in our heads?
Well, when I was an undergraduate and you'd think of historian, you would think of a desk-bound professor in a library, and you would think, especially maybe in Canada, that the library was a little bit too humid because of the summer and whatnot, and musty books getting musty from the humidity, and maybe with a tweed jacket. I suppose I'm wearing a grayish-brown blazer,
jacket.
no elbow pads or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I think that would be an older image of a historian.
Or Harrison Ford, too, I guess, in
Yes,
Indiana Jones.
in Indiana Jones, yes, yes.
To what extent is history a niche field?
In terms of professional historians, in terms of professors, it might be niche, but in terms of people who study history and apply their historical knowledge and the methods of the historian, I don't think it's really a niche field, because you find in all sorts of different environments, people who are actually trained in history, they don't call themselves historians, but they use many of the same skills that we do.
Like what? What skill sets do they use?
I would say two skill sets. One is just writing, and people underestimate how important writing is, how important a concise, whether you're writing a one-page summary report for your company or whether you're writing a 5-page article for a magazine, writing concisely is very important because you're expressing your ideas to an audience that might not know you. They might not know who you are, so you've got to really express this clearly. And the other one is searching, just how to search, whatever it is.
That you look for information.
That you look for information and know how to sift. There's so much information out there today that you know what's the important information for what I'm doing, what's maybe not so important for what I'm doing.
Is there any value to having a history degree or doctorate in these days, this time?
Well, this is one of the big questions. It's a very, very big question. And you're asking a historian, you're asking somebody who changed into history. So I, of course, think there's great value in being a historian or having that education. It is continually discussed, and it always has been, because nowadays, for example, there's such an emphasis on science, and it's like, well, why do we need to know history? And I think part of it is that people have a false image of what historians do, but it's really important to understand, today, it's not as if politics is settled, it's not as if social issues are settled, or cultural issues are settled. It's in fact more diverse and more complicated than maybe 20 years ago. And so you need people who in one way or another understand these dynamics.
And what kind of dynamics do we need to understand?
So for example, if you think like a big change in studying history is understanding ethnic diversity in communities. And in the past, because we would have this model that, Poland is Polish, Canada is Canadian, and we had a very straightforward understanding of what that meant. And nowadays, it's become very, very complex. And in Canada, which is officially bilingual, but now has so many different ethnic groups for whom, French or English might not be their one dominant language, it brings out more complicated questions. And you want to look in the past, what it was like.
I'm glad you brought up language, because you bring it up in the book, and how sometimes you might lose history because it's in a different language. It's interpreted differently. How important is it to have more than one language as a historian?
Well, it's critically important for a historian. And if you think of my own research, for example, I study Russia, so I go to Moscow, and you go to all these nifty little places, and you're reading Russian documents and talking to Russians, and that's really important. Both in terms of me accessing documents, but also in terms of getting along with people, sort of being able to sit down with a Russian and have a conversation on their terms, and you get that rapport, which you otherwise wouldn't have. So that's for me professionally. But otherwise, if you think of bilingualism in just everyday life, I live in Southern California now. There is maybe not a majority Spanish-speaking population, but certainly like 40% or 30%, which have a Hispanic roots. And so for them, if they know Spanish English, they're opening up not just a discussion in Los Angeles, but a discussion in San Diego, and a discussion in Mexico City, and a discussion in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So it really takes them around the world. So that bilingualism is critical.
And I guess too, the interpretation, because sometimes when when something goes from one language to another, kind of changes the context of it a little bit.
Yeah, those are very difficult to trace, even if you're in the archives. But yeah, you certainly need to understand the home language, to understand the nuances, the twists, the expressions, and not so you just get maybe an English translation that is comfortable for the English reader.
You also write about the places that historians work, like archives, libraries. How important are these institutions for a historian?
Oh, they're absolutely critical. And it comes back to your first question about the historian being a niche profession, because actually a historian does not work alone. There are all sorts of people who help the historian in their work, in the same way that the historian also helps all sorts of other people.
Who are some of these other people?
So like archivists, curators, librarians, film professionals, especially working in Los Angeles. And I just, in the book, I wrote about places where a historian works, because I wanted to show that a historian, you might have an image of a historian from a college class or something like that, who's just sitting in the classroom giving a lecture, and then you visit their office, and their office is a mess, and it's a tiny little thing, lots of books, and that's it.
Yeah.
But you go to places. I have a colleague who studies the Atlantic world, and part of his job is to go out on ships, actually. So he goes onto the seas on these ships. I go to Moscow. You go to the funkiest, neatest, weirdest places, archives, for example, in Kazan. Kazan is half Tatar, so half Muslim, half Christian, as in Russian, and they're wonderful places.
Because I think what I liked about the book too, you also say that historians don't just work in those places that we think they do historically. You also talk about like open spaces and Can you elaborate more on that?
Oh yeah, and I'm going to Calgary in a bit to be on a panel with some public historians. And these are historians, and it's another thing I want to emphasize in the book, is that they're not in a university environment. They're outside the university, but they're no less historians. And some of these historians are park historians. So for example, Canada has national parks. These national parks need historians, and they put together stories about these national parks, and they work outdoors. Open air museums need historians. There are all sorts of different environments.
Now with archives and libraries, are they all open to the public?
That's a very good question. It depends where you are. And again, like for example, the Huntington Library just outside of Pasadena in Southern California has certain requirements for its readers. And so you need to come up with a letter saying, please let me read. Other institutions just say show up and we'll show you documents.
Are you okay with that? Do you think that creates like a deterrent for people who are looking for information?
It is definitely a deterrent. The one thing I was thinking about, when you think about the Huntington, they do have a Gutenberg Bible, which is an absolutely precious document. So maybe they have to have a higher standard. But otherwise, I'm not I'm not good about it. But I think another one, which is a deterrent, is sometimes it's the neighborhood in which the institution finds itself that is the deterrent.
Because you talk about the neighborhood in LA, right? In Los
Yeah,
Angeles?
it's the Southern California Research Library. I might be missing the exact name, but it is in a less affluent part of Los Angeles. Whereas if you go to the Huntington Library is surrounded by estates and mansions. And so typically in the American experience, if you are not familiar with this mansion-esque environment, it doesn't even matter that they have restrictions that they put. You will be intimidated by the physical environment in which the library sits. And so there are these things that have to be overcome. And they have, and I know the Huntington, they've been doing a great job at overcoming these, of course. But traditionally, if you look in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, that was a I don't want to say a problem, but it did, yes. It caused separation, yes.
I understand too, if you do have, like you said, the Bible, you don't want everybody to be touching it, and you know, because there's only one. Yeah. But I also think that it's kind of nice to have libraries where people can just go and kind of find things on their own, or you know.
Absolutely, and even university libraries, because like our campus is a private campus, but over the years, the library has become more and more open. So it used to be there was a turnstile. And you know, you had to swipe your card.
Yes, I remember that. My university had that.
Yes, and then you go through the turnstile, and now that's gone. You can just walk in. If you want to borrow a book, then you have to get a card. But even there, the whatever you call the level for getting a card or whatever, it's just they're lowering it. It's like, all right, you have to live in the neighborhood. That's like the requirement or something like that.
You also write about primary sources. Define a primary source for us.
A primary source. Primary source it's always difficult because there are nuances in this, but a primary source would be something such as the memoir of a French revolutionary in 1789. It's written at the time by somebody who experienced the events directly. They might not have experienced all the events directly, but they're in that moment. Similarly, if it's an object, a photograph taken in 1889 would be a primary source from that time period.
Now, how would you, talking about single primary sources, if you're looking at something from a single lens, like the diary of a slave owner, how can you approach that? How do you approach that as a historian?
Well, I think you need to know the context. And one of the things which is always dangerous with a diary is the idea is he's telling the story exactly as it happened. And it's like, well, no, that's probably not what's happening. He's telling the story from the perspective of a slave owner. That's what's happening. At a slave owner in a certain moment of time. So whether it's 1800 or 1840, their economic position will have changed. So the historian has to know the context behind this.
Like what was going on in that
society.
Yes,
to see where that diary actually fits. That's why no single document really stands alone.
You also write that once upon a time, novels were shunned by historians, but now they're actually becoming more acceptable. Yeah. Why so?
Well, there's part of it is a big, if you think of the postmodern movement in the 70s and the 80s, which flipped the story around, because the historians would say, a novel, it's not fact, it's fiction. I want facts, and I'm gonna look at bureaucratic documents or something like that. And then the theorists came along and said, well, if you actually read the work of a historian, it's actually set up like a novel. The historian's monograph or the historian's book starts with an introduction that gets you interested. That's no different from a novel. And then it divides it into chapters which lead you into like the culminating moment of the French Revolution. And then it's like, well, novels do a little bit of a structure like that. And then there's a conclusion where you wrap everything up and there's almost like a happy ending type of thing. And so they flip that around a little bit.
And can films be approached the same way?
Yeah, films can be approached the same way. Certainly, where you see that the manner in which a film is analyzed will change. I like to think of The Godfather as an example, where part of the story was, and people will agree or disagree here, is that The Godfather portrayed mafia life in New York City. But the reverse of that is a lot of the mafiosi, is that the word? The mafioso?
I think so.
A lot of them actually watch The Godfather to find out how they should act. So there's this osmotic relationship between, you're you think that, I guess it's Mario Puzo, who did this, researched their lives, and yet at some point it flips, and they're reading him to find out how they should act. And so there's this.
What's the difference between a fiction and fact when it comes to that?
Well, it's a very that's one of the most contested questions in history, in historical analysis, because a lot of people say there's so many different perspectives from which to analyze something. Why should they trust your word over mine, my word, even when it comes down? It's like, you know what, but it's here in the document. And then you say, but who wrote the document?
Right.
And a lot of historians don't like that, because then you never get certainty. But
there's always like a question of what if.
That's right.
I wanted to show you a clip from a movie from
Okay.
1984, which seems really like a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
The movie Red Dawn, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Okay.
Russians need to take us in one piece, and that's why they're here now. That's why they won't use nukes anymore, and we won't either, not on our own soil. The whole damn thing's pretty conventional now. Who knows, maybe next week will be swords.
What started it?
I don't know, two toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight.
That's simple.
Maybe somebody just forgot what it was like.
Now, how might a historian explain the historical significance of that movie to a student, in first-year history class?
So with that little clip, I would say, because it's set in 1984, so I think the larger question would be popular perceptions of the Soviet Union in 1984. That would be one thing. I don't think you would use the clip for understanding Soviet foreign policy, for understanding American foreign policy, for understanding economics. Sorry, why not? Because I think it's just it's too much set in that fictional setting, whereas the really important thing is sort of what does a popular audience want to hear from a Hollywood film? The other one is in terms of contextualizing it, and that's always very important, that you wouldn't look at that singular film, but you could compare it to Rocky. Because I think Rocky's, I don't know which one, but it's at around that time.
Rocky IV.
And you would look at representations of Russians or representations of the Soviet Union in American filmmaking. And you would try to understand how has that changed since maybe, like, you could look at Dr. Strangelove, which was done, I guess, 3 decades before that, and compare it to a 1984 film to see how filmmakers actually had a different vision of.
And what was the vision of Dr. Strangelove?
Dr. Strangelove was just a comedy about, a comedy. It's a farce about the potential of nuclear disaster and how I learned to love the bomb.
Instead of showing Red Dawn to talk about what was happening in the Soviet Union, what film is there a film that you would use?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because if you look at Red Dawn, part of the Russian historian in me is this is an American perspective. It's a Hollywood perspective. It really only shows you one little bit, and another thing you could get out of it is almost the violence and antagonism of Americans against the Soviets. And what about a Soviet film? And the film that I always think of is Irony of Fate, which was 1976, which is a Soviet comedy about life in the Soviet Union, where they're making fun of themselves. And it gives you a sense that, because here you think of Russians as they're obviously coming across as big, bad, militaristic. Whereas if you look at comedy films in the 70s from the Soviet Union, they make fun of themselves. And so the one is, a lot of people visited the Soviet Union, or a lot of people have seen images of the Soviet Union, and it's all like, oh my gosh, they live in all these gray, blockish apartment buildings. But the film makes fun of it. The Soviets are making fun of their own living situation. And so you get a sense that they don't like it either. And even though we think of it as a censorship state, they were allowed to make fun of their living conditions. So the censorship, it was there, but certain things you could actually, I don't want to say talk freely about, but you could comment on.
So it's kind of like the Hollywood film kind of has a bias.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And especially it's done in, Reagan, it's done during the Reagan years. So, that would also be very important to it.
You also write about, there's one line you say, historians will no doubt examine the role of Beyonce at the inauguration of President Barack Obama in 2013. Why? Why do you think that is?
Because you have a lot of, that example is, I think, paired with an earlier example about music played for the king's ceremony in early 18th century England, and how these sound environments, like nowadays, you might look at Beyonce playing and just go, oh, it's just a pop star playing and whatnot, and go to the next event on your TV. And yet it is actually significant when you think of the manner in which the president portrays himself versus what would Jimmy Carter do? What would, or have done? What would Nixon have done? What type of music did they play at their
So it's not about
events?
what was popular at the time, it's about the personal preference of the president?
Or what the president and his advisors believed, the message they wanted to send when they were having their inauguration. Because historians study coronation ceremonies, scenarios in which leadership, sort of the way they choose to present themselves. Like nowadays, for example, it used to be you always had to wear a tie. And now, society is shifting to the open, the open neck, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's those type of shifts. And with the inauguration of Obama, at some level, it's a different perception of African American values, culture within the American context. So, and that people will look back on, I'm pretty sure, in like 50 years or whenever it starts.
You also write about Muzak. That's the music that's always on somewhere in the elevator or at work. And it's got a historical significance. What is that?
Well, I guess the historical significance is just the manner in which sound environments came to be controlled. In the sense that when you look at the very important books on bell ringing in France in the 19th century, and how the church would ring bells, and ring bells would control the time of the peasants, and now is seen as social control. And so Muzak fits in with that shifting, how we use sound. I don't want to say to manipulate, but to change the habits and daily features of somebody's life.
Like trying to keep people in the stores
Right.
longer
That's
so
right.
they can spend more
That's
money.
right, exactly.
You also talk about oral historians. Who are they?
Oral historians, again, this comes back to, it's related to your question about novels. There was a time when historians would say, no, oral history, no, it's not serious. And oral history being,
Because it was only the written history that was important.
That's right. It's like, can I really trust that person when they're speaking to me? No, I can't use an oral history. I can only use something that's written down. And that was a prejudice because it's written down, well, it's written down by somebody serious because they can write. It's not written down from somebody in the working class who I can't trust because, well, they're in the working class and I'm not. And that was a prejudice against these sources. And so the best example are trial records, where in previously, for example, if you're a trial record in the 19th century, your accent wouldn't be in there. They would edit what you said to make it, like if you had a Cockney accent, it would be edited to make sure that it fit proper English. All your local expressions would be lost out of this. And so a lot of the dynamic would disappear. But nowadays, oral history is incredibly important. Like there's the StoryCorps project in Washington.
And what is that?
The StoryCorps project is, they have a booth in Grand Central Station in New York City, and you go with a pair. So you go with your friend, you go with your mother, your father, your teacher, somebody who you've experienced something with, and you sit down in this booth, and you have, I think it's half an hour, and you have a conversation. The conversation will be recorded and sent to the Smithsonian or to the National Archive in Washington, D.C., and they keep a record of this. And they do this on an ongoing basis. And it's, in terms of an oral history, instead of having a scientist expert ask you a series of pre-planned questions, what you get is, a daughter talking to her mother, how did you cross the border from Mexico in the 1970s? Like, what was that experience like? And you hear these really warm, like heart-wrenching stories, but that are also significant, very significant.
That's fascinating. In Canada, we have oral historians who are going to different places in indigenous communities
Yeah.
and recording languages
Yeah.
because the languages are dying out.
Yeah, no, that's critical.
Yeah. So we've had doctors, journalists, and novelists on this program before who have all written works of history. Has the job of historian become somewhat egalitarian?
I don't know about.
In other words, can anyone be a historian?
Yeah, I think from the historian's perspective, you'd want to answer no. You'd want to answer not anybody can be an historian. In the same way, can anybody be a baker, or can anybody be a carpenter, or can anybody be a doctor? It's like, no, you need some skills. And you need that skill set. But anybody can get that skill set.
And what skill set? Let's just.
Well, I would say very important is as I mentioned at the start, is you want to be able to write. You need to be able to do research, and there you see there's all sorts of possibilities for that research. So, for example, if it's a doctor, and maybe the doctor's retired and they're 65 and they now have time, or I don't know, retirement maybe 70, I don't know, but and they go back and they talk to their older patients, and they want to write experiences, a history of maybe the medical profession or medical care in Toronto in the 1970s. That would be, yeah, absolutely.
So I guess the third component would be curiosity.
Yes,
like
yes,
you mentioned, right?
You're right.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.